Hi guys, ran into quads, but we push on. There's going to be some good hands, including this funky hand here where I get to the river and call down with bottom pair against an absolute poker pro, or was a pro. But yeah, more about that coming up soon. I just want to say thanks for your patience with this video. It's been a little while coming, and big thanks to those people who have subscribed. I have got heaps of great stuff coming up for you, and I am not just talking about vids. I've got some completely free ways for you to increase your bankroll, so I'll put a link up for that. Okay, so we left off in part 1 where we just ran into quads, as we just saw. And if you recall this video, we were trying to stick to key aspects to help beginners, including bet sizing, stack size, stealing. We're going to talk about squeeze play in this part. Again, we're going to talk about re-raising, or 3-betting as it's known. And in particular, I want to keep focusing on a lot of the second level thinking. What is second level thinking? Well, for those of you that don't know, I'm going to go through it very shortly. I'm just going to show a couple of hands. This one here, pocket nines. You recall that when we're out of position, better to raise a little bit more than the min, which is my normal raise, especially from late position, because the chances are you'll be in position, which is going to be a big advantage post flop. Here I'll be out of position against a good player, spin 31, and even though I have quite a strong hand nines, overcards will flop a lot of the time, and it will be a little bit awkward post flop. So definitely don't want to let him just see a cheap flop and make it a min raise. So I make it almost 3x here, and you'll be surprised how this sizing, just a slightly 200 more instead of making it 600 or make it 800, can actually make a difference to the range that they play. And that is, we might fold out some of those more moderate hands that he might call and get involved with this post flop with. Anyway, he just folds, and this is a couple of hands later, and now we are in position, so I do opt for the min raise. We're in the cut-off position, which you recall is next to the button. So we've got a high likelihood of being in position, and King Queen in particular is a good hand to see a flop with, not just because it can flop quite well, but with the raise from the cut-off, the blinds defend usually, especially against a late raise, fairly wide. And King Queen is the sort of hand that can dominate a lot of their calling range, so that's something to be aware of. And I think it's important to already start sort of having a plan for the hand, or a thought process for the hand as early as pre-flop. So already when I raise with King Queen, I'm thinking to myself, I like this situation. A couple of loose players, or in the small blind loose player, and that's going to give me some opportunities, perhaps to flop hands where I dominate their range if they've got like King 10 or Jack Queen, the flop top pair, that sort of thing. So already sort of thinking, okay, and he hasn't re-raised pre-flop. So far we haven't met much, I need to check the flop, so we haven't seen too much strength so far. And that's part of the reason why I opt for the continuation bet here, which remember is when you've raised pre-flop, and then you back that up on the flop with a bet, and most players will go ahead and make the continuation bet the majority of the time, but it's not something that should be automatic. You should always consider the flop texture. Look at the texture of the board, consider your opponent. In this particular spot, it's just a blind, so as we said, you could have a wide range, ace-x, small pairs, pocket twos, could have a hand like, King 10 or something like that, which can't continue. So it's best just to, even though we would beat a hand like King 10, it's best just to keep the initiative and fire the C-bet. The majority of the time he's going to fold. It doesn't have to be a big bet. And a couple of important things to note, even though I've mentioned that you don't want to chase and go after chase backdoor draws as they're called. You can see here we do have a couple of backdoor draws, which alone is not a huge plus, but when you factor them into the fact that we are c-betting against just a small blind, it's worth mentioning that we have two overcards, so a king or a queen is probably going to give us the best hand. A spade gives us a flush draw, a 10 will give us an up and down draw, and therefore there's more cards on the turn that can help us, and that means that by betting the flop, if he does call, we now have the option, say a 3 of spade comes on the turn, we now have the option, do we want to fire again? And if we do, that's called a double barrel, which I think is quite a plausible play. The other option we would have would be to just check back and take that free card and perhaps try and hit that spade or the king or the queen, which might also be good. So you can see a lot of advantages stemming from the fact that we're continuation betting here. Obviously the worst case scenario is he check raises us and now we have to follow hand. But like I said, he's only defended from the small blind, and I think this would be kind of a scary board for him. So I'd like to see bet here and try and get more information about our hand, and expect him to fold a whole bunch, which he does. So I just spend a little bit of extra time on that hand, and I will be spending a little bit of extra time on a lot of the hands like that because I just want to go through the thought process in a little bit more depth. And so, I think that's an example of you want to be thinking not just too automatically, you want to be thinking about the possible scenarios that might arise because that thought process enables you to deal with those situations as they do pop up. And be sort of prepared for them, and it just encourages, it just promotes better poker play, just a better thought process. Now this is just coming back to what I was saying about multi-level thinking. This will be an example of it here, and it's a hand that I don't play particularly well, I think, post-flop, but pre-flop you can see here that I've raised, and so this is called the 3-bet. And remember we were talking about stack size. You can see that there's 1,000 in the pot to start the hand, 200, 400 blinds, there's 400 in there in antes. So it's 1,000 in the pot to start pre-flop. So you can see that our opponent started with around 17,000. So that's 17 times 1,000. So he has an M of 17. And we have started the hand with a little bit more than that. But M17 will be the effective stack size. And so, being at this stack size, we can put a lot of pressure on him with this re-raise, because for him to re-raise, we've made it 3,000, he raised to 1,000, he's going to have to make it at least 5, maybe 6, 6.5 would be sort of a normal re-raise here, which would be what we call the 4-bet if he was to re-raise us. That's a large percentage of his stack, and it would be, say he made it, 6,000. Well, if he started the hand with 17,000, he's now getting over a third of his stack in. That's generally not a play that opponents make. They don't usually stick in much more than a quarter of their stack and then fold to, in this case, if I was to 5-bet and jam all in, if he then folded, he'd be giving up a third of his stack without even, playing the hand or seeing the flop. Generally not a play players make because it's just a large portion of your stack to commit on a bluff. So what I'm really saying is that it puts him under a lot of pressure here, because for him to re-raise, I think that it means that he has, a very strong hand that he's willing to commit with, which is part of the reason why I opt to make the 3-bet here. Although Ace-10 might be the best hand some of the time, I'm kind of really defining my hand. I'm putting my opponent on pressure. If I did just call, maybe more opponents would come in behind, or someone would potentially try to squeeze us, that is re-raise to, which I'll go into in more detail later, and get us to fold. And it just really asserts authority in terms of taking initiative in position, puts him under a lot of pressure. So you see a lot of players make this raise with a hand like Ace-10 or Ace-Jack, when sometimes you think, well, why didn't they just call? It's not an awesome hand. Not a clear raise like Ace-King or pocket queens or something, but it is really just to take the initiative with a hand that might be good, but you also have position. And if he did move all in or re-raises pre-flop, we can fold. We've only made it 3,000, so that play doesn't have to work very often to be profitable. And if he does re-raise, then we can fold the hand. So coming back to what I was saying about multi-level thinking, I just want to clarify a point about it. And I'll go through exactly what it is now. I've checked back the flop, and the villain has checked, so he's checked flop and turn. So when we're thinking about what he might have, well, he's raised pre-flop, and he's checked on the flop and checked again on the turn. So it looked like he could have had a hand like 8s and 9s or something like that, 7s, 5s. But I don't think he'd check twice. Any information you have on opponent is obviously going to help you, decipher what his actions mean. But I don't think he would check twice. And the reason why I think that is that unless we're doing something really tricky or trying to be really sneaky and checking back with a big hand or a big pair, which is very, very unlikely on this sort of little bit kind of a wet board, it's more likely we would just bet if we had, say, kings. So what we've done now is think at the second level, and that is put our opponent on a hand. And we don't think that he has a hand like 7s, 5s, 8s, because I think he would bet turn. So I think he has a hand like Ace-Queen or King-Queen. Maybe the same hand as us, Ace-10. Okay, so we're thinking at the second level, we're thinking about what our opponent has. Now the third level of thinking would be thinking about what he puts us on. So if we were in his shoes, we'd be thinking, well, ace is up is checked back on the flop, so he probably doesn't have a pair, and now he has bet the turn. What does that mean? Okay, I guess he could have had a hand like, maybe he did have a hand like 10s, 9s, 8s, was a little bit scared of the jack, decided to check back. Maybe he's got ace king, or some sort of high hand like that he thinks is now just the best hand because I've been checking. Maybe he's got a flush draw. This is what's going through his mind. So now we're thinking at the third level, and he calls now. So with all that in mind, you would really think that for him to call there on that turn, it looks like he's got either a draw such as king queen of diamonds or clubs, I guess maybe the ace ten of diamonds, or I guess sometimes he might play a fives or sevens this way. Although as I said, I would expect him normally to just lead the turn, since thinking at the third level, we kind of just look like we have high cards, and he wouldn't really want to give us a free card if he had, say, sevens, because if we had ace king or ace queen, we could hit an ace, a king, or a queen, depending on which we had, and also the diamonds and clubs as well. If we did have some sort of flush draw, it's a possibility. So I don't know if he'd want to give us any more free cards, but some players do play that sort of passive style, so it's possible. But it looks more like he's got a draw, and so when he jams into us on the river, what would you be guessing? He had here. Well, if he did have a small pair, I mean, the only pair, would he do that with sevens? Well, most players, aren't going to turn a set, aren't quite thinking deep enough to turn a hand like sevens into a bluff here. Generally, that's quite an advanced play. So let's just rule out the fact that he's thinking, he's able to turn mediocre hands into bluffs. So what can he have? So he can have the small pair, I guess, threes, but as we said, seems quite unlikely. So it looks like he's got king queen of clubs, unless he's just freaked out and he's jammed like ace ten of diamonds, and he's just like, I'm just going to try to represent flush here. The reason why we can say pretty accurately, remember king queen of clubs, is because we have the ace and the ten of clubs, and he's not calling with much worse, because remember we re-raised, we made that 3-bet pre-flop, so he's not going to call with king nine of clubs. And if he had like jack queen or jack king of clubs, we would have heard about it before. He wouldn't play the hand this way by checking flop, checking turn. He wouldn't take that passive style, because that would be such a strong hand. He'd be trying to get a little bit more action. And so you can really narrow his hand down pretty specifically by using your multi-level thinking. And now it's an interesting hand, because I don't think I've played it particularly well in terms of post-flop. I think I should have c-bet on the flop. The turn bet was debatable. Some might favour the bet. Some might say, well, ace high could be good on the turn. So, and you do have, any club, which is definitely going to be good. So maybe you should check and, decide on the river based on his actions what you want to do. But all that aside, I think just looking at it from the point of multi-level thinking, I think there's something to take away from it. And so that's something I want to spend a little bit more time on. And I just want to I know I've spent quite a bit of time on this already, but I just want to add one more thing for those of you that are a little bit familiar with this concept, perhaps have come across it before or read about it. I just want to clarify that there's a little bit of a discrepancy between what some consider the first and second levels and others. So a lot of forums and a lot of poker circles consider thinking about your own cards as a first level, thinking about your opponent, what they have is a second level, and thinking what your opponent is putting you on is the third level. And so you can see here, this is kind of like a typical what you might find online if you looked for multi-level thinking, which is a little bit different from, say, what you see here, which is from David Sklansky, who is a master of fundamental poker concepts. And although this is a cash game book, the same principle applies, and he actually states that the first level will actually call it the 0th level to reflect its triviality. So he sort of skips a level in terms of he calls just thinking already about what your opponent has the first level. I prefer to, and most of my students, I find it's just easier to consider the first thought process as the first level, and so that's from here on in, when I say the first level, I'm talking about thinking about your own hand. And so most players should already be thinking at the second level, and that is thinking about what your opponent has. And that's something I really want to encourage and what we'll be focusing on. But also, if we can, a couple of times take a sort of a sneak peek at the third level, which is thinking about what our opponent might put us on, as we did in that case there. So I just wanted to clarify that. Okay, so moving on, we've got pocket eights here in the small blind. It's 7-handed. So, you know, obviously that's one of the first things I see when I look here is, okay, well, it's a little bit shorter handed, so generally that means that eights go up a little bit in value, less likelihood of big hands being out there. But you can see here it's actually been jammed all in from second, so who out there would call, who out there would fold, what sort of hand do you think he would have? Well, he is, if you have a look at his M size, yeah, around M5. So, you know, that's pretty short. As I said, it's only seven-handed. M5 players are pretty desperate. They're getting into what I call the red zone, which is when they're, you know, going to be pushing sort of more than you know, just premium hands. They're certainly going to be pushing some more marginal hands, because picking up the blinds in this case adds around 20% to his stack-ish, so that's like a huge increase. So he doesn't need to have a great hand. So I think with pocket eights, it's a pretty easy decision that we want to play the hand. So do we want to call, or do we want to do what's called isolate? Isolating is when you re-raise to try to kick out, in this case, a big blind, and make sure we get heads up against that opponent where we feel he's pushing pretty wide, and we're confident that eights is going to be the best hand the majority of the time. I mean, he could obviously have it, you know, he could roll over queens, but he could also roll over fours, you know, king 10 suited, hands like that. So eights I feel are in good shape, and so I want to go ahead and play them. I opt for the isolation raise here. Now, I think that it is kind of deep. You know, if you look at this 14,000 in the big blind, so he's got sort of close to M15. But remember, you know, it is just a one player to beat. You know, if we had like 3 or 4 players to beat, we might not be isolating with eights in this way. But we've only got the one player to beat. Eights is going to be quite a strong hand. And if you look at it from a mathematical point of view, it's fine, because he's not going to find a hand nines or better often enough for it to be a consideration for us to really give a second thought here to whether we should isolate or not. So it's pretty clear play. And this play does open a strong hand. And it's important to note the sort of hands that players will roll over when they're short. You'll notice that we turn the 8, which is obviously great. We lock it up on the turn, and we scoop in a nice pot there. But yeah, it's important to notice when players are short what the sort of hands that they're turning over, because lots of beginning players are really unclear of what sort of, you know, the desperate nature of having a short stack. They think they can stick around. They think they can wait around, and you find them sometimes, you know, still hanging around with just 2 BBs, waiting for that. You know, I need to get ace 10 or better. You know, I don't want to go all in with, you know, ace 2 or 7-8. You know, something like that. But actually, that is the correct play to be more aggressive, and definitely to play those hands. But I go through a lot of that in the PokerNerve course content. I don't want to go too much through push ranges now, because we've already got, you know, so much that we're working on right now in this tournament. So moving along, I've got the pocket fives here. There's 15,000 in pre-flop, so it's kind of a debatable raise, because we do have the small pair. But I think at the time, you know, I've been feeling pretty comfortable with the way the table was playing. There wasn't anything too wild happening, so I decided to open. And again, it's a good spot to think about what our opponents might have, if we want to c-bet, and what sort of sizing we should use. Well, it's important here to note that if they've got an ace, they're obviously going to continue, and if they don't have an ace, they're probably not going to continue. They probably don't have, you know, better than tens. It's pretty unlikely. They probably would have re-raised pre-flop if they had, you know, jacks, queens, or kings, obviously aces. So that sort of narrows it down to, I guess, hands like king, queen, king, jack suited, and smaller pairs. And I mean, if they did flop a set of 6s or 7s, which is possible, you know, we're certainly going to find out. So we don't really need to bet large here. So you notice that, you know, I actually bet under half the pot. Probably could have bet even smaller, but I think that's fine. And, you know, they both quickly fold. So we're really just testing, you know, it's really a probe bet. Do you have an ace? It doesn't even need to be as big as half pot. And the answer was no, we don't. And, you know, the big blind is going to be defending pretty wide. And so we only really had that one player that was a concern, but he was calling from the hijack in position. He could have had some sort of speculative hand. The stacks are deep enough for him to be speculating. So we don't have to necessarily presume that he has a hand, you know, like ace-jack or some sort of, you know, big hand. He could have a lot of different hands, I think. So I think the c-bet there was a decent play. very next hand sevens. Same sort of thing, these small pairs from early, you have to be careful with them. You don't want to get too carried away with them. Remember that the idea of playing these sort of smaller medium pairs is generally to, they don't flop great because most of the time they'll be overcards. So they are quite speculative in the sense that when they do flop, they flop big a small percentage of the time, but when they do flop big, you can win a very big pot because you'll hit sets. And so, it's important to be aware of when you're playing these speculative hands, and in this case, as I am from early position, if there's only short stacks behind you, then you really want to give careful consideration before you go ahead and raise with it. Because as a speculative hand, it means you need deep stacks behind. Now, this is a rebuy tournament. It was a $50 rebuy, so there are some deeper stacks behind. Generally, in rebuy tournaments, the stacks are a little bit deeper because there's a whole bunch of rebuys early. Players build up their stacks, gamble a bit early, build up stacks, and so that's part of the reason why I decided to raise and then call here, because it's only 2,000 to call, and you can see that we still have 31,000 behind. So, we still have the opportunity to win a big pot if we do flop a 7. And, especially because we've raised early, and this again comes back to thinking early about the hand. If you're already thinking at that second level, what could our opponent have? Well, if we've raised UTG, that is the first position at the table with, in this case, we've got another 8 players behind us. Usually players are opening pretty tight from that spot. Usually players are only playing premium hands from UTG, and he's re-raised or 3-bet us, knowing that. You have to presume that he would know that. That's a fairly elementary type of thinking. So if he knows that and he's re-raised us, chances are he has a really big hand. Why is that important? Well, when we flop a 7, there's now a higher likelihood that we will get his whole stack. Not the case if we say, had have raised late position and the big blind called. Well, big blinds defend pretty wide, so a lot of the time he's not going to flop strong enough to really continue even when we flop a set. So, it's important to weigh up these types of different situations based on all the information available, and here the position, I think, is a key element. So, certainly you want to be factoring all that in, and it made the call when we were re-raised a little bit clearer because we felt like his range was weighted really towards strong hands. So sorry, yeah, I did fold on that flop after he bet here. Yeah, just check fold on that board there. It seems a pretty dangerous board given what we just said about his range of hands. So a couple of hands later, and this is where I want to talk about squeezing in a little bit more detail. And the concept of the squeeze, it's a very strong looking re-raise because 2 players have already voluntarily entered the pot. And so you can see a raise here to 1,200 and a call. But the effective part of the squeeze comes from the fact that the player that's called has just called and not re-raised. So therefore, he shouldn't have a hand that can call a re-raise because he would have re-raised himself if he had a premium hand. If he was, had queens and so forth, he would have re-raised. So his range is pretty wide. He could have a very speculative hand that can't call a re-raise like pocket 3s or king 10 suited or something like that, especially given the fact here that the players are in late position. And so you're really only focusing on getting that first player to fold. And so when I make my 3-bet here, I make it sort of 3.5 times the 1,200, which I probably could have made it a little bit larger. Generally 3-bets are between sort of 2 and 3 times around 2 and 3 times what the initial opener makes his raise. But out of position you want to make it a little bit larger, and also you want to make it a little bit larger for the extra players that enter the pot. So if I was against 1 player here, I might make it say 3,000. Against 2 players, I think around 4,000 or slightly bigger is a sort of sizing that's reasonable because you don't want to give them a good price to call. Although I guess if we had aces, we might want to give them a little bit of a slightly more tempting price. But at the same time, you don't want to in doing so give away any information that you do have a hand that big. And so I think with 9s here, it's kind of a close decision. And one thing I am an advocate of is I do say how you should be careful re-raising hands as strong as 9s in terms of speculative value. And what I mean by that is I can call here for 900 and the stacks are very deep, it's multi-way, great chance if I flop a 9 to win a big pot. And so that's the advantage of these hands. And some players, I think, overplay the hands in terms of, maybe re-raising here with like sevens, even nines. In nines is, I think, pretty close because, they have such good speculative value. So certainly be careful that you don't raise yourself off a hand. And I think the mistake here would be to be raising this hand to fold. I think that would be a mistake because you're giving up such great speculative value. So I'm really close on this hand because I feel like if I do raise with it, I now feel committed to call off. Now, why would I be calling? It's a pretty deep call off, and it is pretty marginal. And it's probably not my standard play, to be honest. But given the fact that these players, it's quite a late position open. There's now already 4,000 in the pot. The second player, I'm not too worried about because, as I said, he just called. So really focusing on that first player, you can see there was 1,500 in the pot to start, and he has around 22,000. So he's got an M of around 14.5, let's say. So getting much deeper than that, I don't think getting in nines is a great play. But here it does look kind of squeezy. So now again, we're thinking at that second level. We're thinking about how other players might interpret our raise. And a lot of players, and I can't recall exactly what I thought of, these players, especially this particular player that opened, if he's the sort type of player that's smart enough to consider re-raising here with a less than premium hand because our raise does look squeezy. Some players definitely would, so it's definitely worth taking into account, depending on the level that a player is thinking at. Now, if you're playing a $1 rebuy, I'd be less inclined to just be thinking that he's going to be thinking we're squeezing and re-raise light here, because he might not even know what a squeeze is. But in a $50 rebuy, there's a little bit increased likelihood of the player understanding the concept, being aware of it, and playing back at us here. And he does actually jam all in. So we've as I said, I'm definitely not raising to fold. So I've taken this line. This is what we call a thin line because it's a little bit unclear. There's some risk involved, and you can see we are actually in a flip. So he actually did have a premium hand in this particular situation. But who's to say that he wouldn't have jammed there with sevens or ace king, ace queen, king queen, hands like that? And if he is, then the play. I think is quite good. And also don't remember that most of the time they're probably both going to be folding pre-flop. It is just a late position raise and a call. So a lot of the time we just pick up the 4,000 that was already in the pot. And then the other times when he does re-raise as he has and we call, well, sometimes we'll be ahead like we are now. Yes, sometimes we will be behind and you'll roll over the big tamale burger. But here you can see it's quite a favourable spot because it's a massive pot. We're slightly ahead. Obviously, we prefer to get it in better shape, but when you're running good and dodging any club, any queen, any ace, or any king on the turn, and managing to hold up with two pair nines and tens, it's a good thing. So we managed to hold up there. It was a really big pot, and it's a pot that's going to propel us to make a very deep run in this tournament. And so moving along now, you can see we've got queen 10 suited here. And it's been opened from the UTG. Remember we said UTG players often open with premium hands. And the second position player is called. So with that in mind, it's not quite the same dynamic as before in terms of squeezing. But squeezing, if we were to raise here, it certainly could be interpreted as a squeeze. Something that would be working for us is the fact that if they're thinking players again, they should know, and this is again thinking on that second level, they should know that if we are re-raising against a UTG opener and an early position caller, we probably have a very strong hand. Now, I think it's a little bit risky in this spot, but we are very deep, extremely deep. 60,000, I've got 53,000, 60,000 from the UTG player, 35,000 for the second position player. So I think if you're uncomfortable playing post flop, if you're newer to the game, definitely fold. I felt a little bit more comfortable here that I'd be able to make good decisions post flop. But I was a little bit, I did regret it a little bit that I made this call because there are some players behind that, certainly could just jam all in. Because they have that sort of stack size that would jam all in. And you can see here that Turk Malloy, or Galen Hall as he's known in live circles, who won the PCA in the Bahamas a couple of years ago for $2 million. He does actually jam all in here on the button. So I would presume, he had a pretty good hand. But in any case, the UTG player, you know, isolates. So recall, isolations from before, goes ahead and re-raises. As he should, I guess, with a hand like Ace Queen. Galen turns over a really surprising hand here, Jack 8 suited. I think he was getting pretty short. He was around M8 or 9, which is a decent 3-betting, squeezing stack size. He did have some fold equity. But I guess he thought that a lot of the time, the pot had become quite large, and a lot of the time he'd be in a flip. He was squeezing in the sense that he was only really worried about that initial opener, as he should be, because it was a UTG opener and he did have a premium hand. But he is in a flip. So personally, not a huge fan of the play, but I don't think it's that bad either. Because he did need to make a move, and he's got a chance to win a huge pot, but he doesn't get lucky there, so he's eliminated. And moving on, it's almost an orbit later. We're in the big blind with Jack Queen suited, offsuit, and the hijack player has jammed all in. Give you guys a little bit of time to think about this. You can see that he had 5,000, 2,100 in the pot. So he's only got an M of sort of less than 3. I think that if those out there, if they said they would call here, I think that's a pretty clear decision. Unless you know that for some reason the player is a huge rock or a nit, as they called. I think that you're getting a really good price here with Jack Queen, because he should be jamming really wide, as I said earlier, because he's desperate, he's short, and he's in late position. Now, if he had been in early position, UTG, I just want to point out something. A mistake that players often make, and a mistake that I used to make, is to presume that a player jamming from early position is jamming pretty wide because they think, well, the blinds are coming, I'll be even shorter, it's now or never. That's actually not the case, and I know a few people think like this because some of my students have said this, and that's the way I used to think actually. It's not the case. The reason why they're short and they're in UTG position is because they've been waiting. So there's no reason why they're not going to continue to wait. They're going to let the blinds pass, and they're going to continue to wait for a good hand. And so time and time again, if you have that thinking and you go, oh, well, call, he's short, but he's early, he knows the blinds are coming, he's probably jamming light. No, he's been waiting. That's why he's short from early. If he wasn't jamming, if he was jamming correctly wide, he probably wouldn't be early short. He would have been jamming and either eliminated or doubled up or have more chips. So, that's I think something worth pointing out. But not really. Doesn't really apply here because he's quite late position. So it's a pretty easy call, and he has the sort of hand that you can expect. And so we have him dominated. So obviously, really good shape. And we do manage to hold up with just a queen high with the pair of kings and the ace there. So yeah, I mean that's I think it's pretty straightforward. But as I said, I think that beginning players there's a little bit of uncertainty, and that's fine. I mean that's part of the game, and it takes experience and also some studying of the fundamentals to know what players should be jamming with and what players should be calling with. And I'm going to use a pretty advanced term now, and so don't panic, but equilibrium is a term that's used to refer to this. And equilibrium is basically making a mathematically correct play. And he just made that. He just made that with a jam of 10 jack suited with his stack size. From the hijack, it's a correct play. And then the call from the big blind is also a correct play with Jack Queen. So both of us played the hand correctly. And sometimes that's just the nature of the game. Sometimes things just don't go your way. I mean, if he was to fold that hand, he may have found a better spot later, but he would have made a mistake by folding this hand right now. Same with us. We happen to have him dominated, but not being results orientated. The call is correct. Based on the range that he should be jamming, it's a correct play based on the equilibrium theory, which is something for more advanced lessons in the PokerNerve course. So moving on, we have got the big tamales here. A pair of beautiful aces, and you can see there's a massive four-way all-in here. No, it folds around to the big blind who calls, so I wished it was going to be a huge all-in, but not the case. And very good player in the big blind here. Know how he plays. Play with him quite a bit, and so that's definitely going to help my decisions here. You can see that I opt to bet on the flop. No reason why not to. It's a pretty good flop because it's a sort of flop that, again, thinking about what he might have, might connect with a big blind calling range, and we have raised early. So I don't expect him to be, and this player I know doesn't defend too wide, so he could have connected in that flop in some way, but I continue to try and get value on the turn, and he just folds. So still good to pick up that pot. Accumulating some chips now quite nicely, and we did win a couple of flips, which is always fantastic when that happens. You can see it folds around, and there's 2,000 in the pot. Okay, so take a look at the big blind, his stack, work out his M, decide what you would like to do. I think a lot of beginning players here are they might like to just raise and then decide, sometimes even raise fold because they think he has almost 15,000. It's a huge mistake. It's definitely mathematically correct to be playing this hand for all the chips, given the fact that he's only M7. So we've got one player to beat. He's only M7, and we have Ace7. And I don't just make this stuff up. This is just mathematical. It's like me saying 1 + 1 is 2. So how are we going to play it? There's a couple of options. It's something I very, very rarely recommend, and I probably still don't really recommend doing it. Limping is often a misunderstood aspect of the game. Limping, in my mind, is actually a very advanced play, but advanced players don't use it. Beginners use it. The thing about the limp is it's encouraging players to raise behind you. It's encouraging flops, and so you need to be able to read players and read situations really well. And if you can do that, you can get yourself in some really interesting situations by limping with some good hands, or marginal hands, and mixing up your play, seeing flops. You can do all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And there's some players out there that I have in mind when I'm talking about this that use the limp really effectively. I don't want to give away too many of their secrets because some of the stuff I've seen them do is pretty mind-blowing. But it is covered in the PokerNerve course, so check it out. But here I think the limping. It's a play I see beginners make sometimes. It's actually not too bad in this spot because I think the big blind will just jam a lot. But I think that it's best just most of the time just to jam all in. It just keeps the hand clean. You don't have to see a flop when he checks back. If he's a thinking player, he might think, well, why is he limped? He's probably trying to trap me. And as I said, I usually say never ever limp. I just want to get that straight. You do usually say that. But yeah, there can be a time and a place for it. This could be considered one such time. But the jam all in is definitely fine. And you might think, well, what's going to call us? Only better hands. Well, if he's not a good player, that's true. If he's not a thinking player, only better hands will call us. But if he's a good player and an MTT regular, he's going to call with a lot of hands because he should know that we're going to be jamming really wide from the small blind because he's only M7. And so we're going to be jamming mathematically correct hands. And this is a big difference between it's like a $1 tournament and say a $100 or $200 tournament. Is the player in the big blind is going to be more aware of stack size. And it does take time to get used to. And hopefully these videos are helping you to sort of start to open your mind up and appreciate certain concepts. It's definitely in terms of stack size. I think a lot of players, it's very misunderstood. So often I see a player go, I didn't agree with that. Oh no, I think you shouldn't have jammed that deep. And that's great. I love to hear it. I love the feedback. But when I say why, well, they go, well, just because I don't think. There's lots of books out there. There's lots of mathematics. There's no reason to think. Just check it out. Do the maths. Find out the real answer. It's not some puzzle. Can you jam A7 into an M7 big blind? It's not a mystery or a puzzle. I'm not sure if it's correct. It's a straightforward mathematical situation. How often is he going to have a hand better than A7? How often is he going to have that hand? How often is he going to call with it? And how often is he just going to fold and we pick up what's already in the pot? How often is he going to call with worse hands like King, Queen, and so forth? I am getting pretty technical here, but what I'm really trying to do is open your mind up because a lot of people are very narrow-minded with stack sizes, and it's amazing how often I see someone type, oh no, I don't think that's correct, but they actually have absolutely no justification of how to back it up. So yeah, I think keeping an open mind in this game is really important because everyone thinks they're awesome. Everyone thinks they're the greatest player ever. well, everyone thinks, I should be winning every tournament. I don't make many mistakes. I play fantastic. The truth is, even myself in this tournament, I've been playing for 10 years. I actually make a lot of errors in this tournament, and when I go back over it, I see hands and I go, "Ooh, that was nasty. Why'd I do that?" So it's really important to review your hands, keep improving, keep an open mind, and do the PokerNerve course, because you will get really, really good. Here you can see that I've raised early with pocket kings, and I have flopped top set. So the thought of slow playing, definitely consideration. You could just check back. But, my style is to always be sort of putting players under pressure and betting. So I don't really need to, sort of get too tricky here. Even though the draw's not, the board's not too bad, it's a little bit wet with the spades and the 4-7 there, but there's certainly an argument for slow playing. But given the fact that I see bet a pretty high frequency, I decided to just do what I would normally do. And he did call us before on the flop, so he might sort of, think, well, he's raising a lot, he's c-betting a lot. I might try a little cheeky something here, So I think betting there is fine. And on that note, I think that I will wrap this part up. There'll be one more part. It's getting pretty close now, very deep. I think there's just, looks like there's about 20 odd players left. So hopefully I haven't fried your brain. If I have, hopefully I've fried it, in a good way, just sort of medium rare, because certainly don't panic. I've treated a lot of these hands. I've gone through them in a lot of detail, the way a professional player would. So don't panic if you didn't get certain concepts. As long as you're aware of certain concepts, there'll be things that you'll come across later, and as you hear more about it, you go, yeah, I've heard of that, and let me check out more about what that is. Okay, I've got that now. I've got that under my belt. You keep adding skills, and hopefully you've picked up some new skills and acquired some knowledge that you can apply at the tables on some of the concepts that we've discussed in detail this part, and there'll be plenty more coming up in part 3, where we'll bring this tournament to a close. So thanks again for joining me. This has been Aces Up for PokerNerve.com.